Hi, this is the Magnificent Midlife Podcast, and I'm Rachel Lancaster. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now is our time. Today I am sharing another podcast from the archives, and it's Dr Kathryn Mannix. I've actually had Dr Kathryn Mannix on the podcast twice because she is so amazing. And this one is the first one. It is talking about death, because Kathryn is a specialist in the palliative care of the dying and spent her career helping people die, helping the families of people who were dying. And this podcast is longer than most of my podcasts because I felt that it warranted it. And personally, I could listen to Kathryn talking forever. She has written another book subsequently, How to Have Tender Conversations, called Listen. And I actually listened to the audiobook version of that, and it is just amazing. Kathryn is another master storyteller, and she brings these books to life with the stories that she tells. And if you are struggling because somebody in your life is dying, or you just want to be better prepared for your own death, because guess what? None of us gets out alive. This is a podcast to savor and enjoy. So please do enjoy my conversation with Dr. Kathryn Mannix. Kathryn, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
I would like to start off. Why did you feel you needed to write this book?
I had an experience, which actually is described in the book, of meeting a family at the emergency department of our hospital, gathered in sorrow around an ambulance trolley of a very elderly man who'd just been brought in, having collapsed at home with a really long, complicated medical history of lots and lots of different things being wrong with him. The miracle really was that he was still alive, and he was only just about still alive. When I said to his wife and to his adult sons that their dad was so sick that he was probably going to die, and what did he say he would want if he was ever so sick that he might die, and they said, oh, we never talked about it. And then one of them actually did admit that Dad had tried to talk to him about it, in fact on several occasions, and he'd always told his dad not to be so maudlin. And he got really, really upset, and he started to cry a bit. And then his brother tried to make him feel better by admitting that actually Dad had also tried to talk to him, get one of those attorney documents sorted out. And he'd said, Dad, you're going to live forever. Don't worry about it. And luckily, the mother, who, like the father, was in her late 90s, said, boys, your dad and I have talked about this a lot, and he doesn't want to be messed around with, and we should just let him go. That's what Dad wants. That man was taken to he was lucky that there was a single bedroom. He spent the rest of the day dying with his family around him. And he was beautifully managed in the emergency department, because the palliative care team and the emergency department had been working together to do something about better end-of-life care for people who pitch up so sick that they're dying. But the family just stayed with me. I couldn't let it lie, as Bob Mortimer might say. And I kept turning over and over in my mind, how can we keep doing this just one family at a time? We can't, can we? It's a national problem. It's a public health issue. And we've got to get people talking about dying. We've got to get people telling their families what they want about dying. And gradually it dawned on me that although, inside we all just think that we're still a teenager, gradually it dawned on me that actually I'm not still a teenager. And actually I've been working for 30 years at the bedsides of dying people in their homes and in hospices, and largely in a very big, busy hospital. And I might have something to offer to the public discussion but I wasn't quite sure how to offer it. So I took early retirement to just create the space. And a few interesting things happened, one of which was an interview on Radio 4's One to One. And I was very, very fortunate that a literary agent heard that interview and got in touch. And it all kind of rolled on from there. So as in anything in life, as you're walking through it, you've got no idea where the next step even is. And when you look backwards, it's all perfectly linear and it absolutely makes sense. But it didn't feel anything like that at the time.
Well, I'm so glad you've written it, because it is such a book that everybody needs to read. And I would just say, honestly, just go and read this. But as I said to you before we started recording, it is so beautifully written. You know, I mean, as I said to you, you are a writer. This is it's quite phenomenal. And also the way you have brought the stories to life, and the characters and the personalities to life, and the words that you've used. I mean, it is a pleasure to read, as well as being deeply, deeply moving. But did you keep notes? Did you keep a diary?
So I guess there are two things to say about this then. One is that I'm from a family of storytellers. You know, I grew up having stories told to me by both of my parents. And when I became the big enough sister to tell stories, I also told stories to my younger brothers and sisters. And we use stories a lot in medical training. You know, learning how diseases work is dull. Learning how a disease affects an individual and changes their life is fascinating. So students remember things if you hang the whole thing around a particular person and a particular story. So we use storytelling a lot in medicine. But when I was a medical student, when I was a junior doctor, I would sometimes find that there was somebody left in my mind where I couldn't put them down. I couldn't move away from them. And so I used to write them down. They're not all sad stories. I mean, some of them are very, very happy stories. The first baby I ever delivered when I was a medical student is one of them. And my rule was that I could only write a single side of A4 so that it didn't get self-indulgent, but I was just writing it out of my head. And of course, I couldn't ever write real names down. So they're all dated, but there are no names on them. And I just kept them. I just kind of filed them away. I wondered what I would do with them. Sometimes I would get them out, and sometimes rereading them as an older doctor and somebody who knows more, I would notice things that I hadn't noticed at the time. So they've kind of grown in my memory, even though they've stayed the same on the page. Some of them have been used for teaching medical students over the years, or junior doctors. But it meant that I actually had a set of observations to call upon when I was writing. But one of the things that was fascinating was some of the people I've written about aren't in the observation sheets. But when I'd be reading the observation sheet, I think, oh yes, I remember that guy. Now, wasn't he the guy whose wife had a row with a relative of the patient in the bed next door? Oh, that family round the bed next door. Oh, that patient. Oh my goodness. And gradually the kind of spotlight would grow wider. And I'd remember this whole bay of patients, this kind of little moment in time, and how they interacted with each other, and funny things that happened or sad things that happened, who the nurses were I was working with over that particular shift or whatever it was. So it's lovely to have the snapshots because they're a starting point, but they're a starting point for remembering other things as well.
What you've said then has just reminded me of the Amaryllis, and how that caused great mirth, didn't it, amongst the poor ladies.
So I've had several people on Twitter post me photographs of their amaryllises as they've been progressing, and people are just going to have to read the book to find out about what the amaryllis story is.
But it's very funny. It's very funny. It's lovely. But there's those lovely touches throughout it. Yeah, I thought you must have kept notes, but that's very interesting as well, that you are a natural storyteller. But that's the thing, isn't it? When we learn things and we remember things so much better if there's a story associated with it.
Absolutely. And it's how we make sense of everything, isn't it? It's how we make sense of our own lives. It's how we make sense of people that we know. Yeah, that's why it works.
And I know you're really, really keen that we stop pussyfooting around with language, and that we get back to saying death and dying. And I think that was what attracted me in the first instance, actually, because I am big on saying death and dying. I really struggle to say things like passed away. I usually try and take my cue from what the grieving person is saying, but I really struggle with it because it just doesn't come naturally.
Yeah, I think dying people, I think grieving people absolutely have the right to choose whatever words get them through. That's not for us to kind of thought police them. But unless we use the language, we'll lose it. And it's very difficult to talk to somebody about the process of dying, which is really, for all of the additional bits and bobs that have gone into the book, it's really what the book is about, that there is a process to dying that's recognizable and describable and anticipatable and to some extent manageable. And we can't talk to people about that if we can't use the D words. You know, we are talking about dying. We are talking about the time when you are close to death. We are talking about how we're going to manage as you die. We're talking about how your family will be when you're dead. And it's really important to use the language. And I think you can use passed and passed away in a completely flippant way, or you can use it in a very gentle and kind way. And you can use dead and dying in a callous and unfeeling way, but you can use it with absolute gentleness and kindness and love. And I think that, you know, love is another one of those words that we don't use because it's a bit embarrassing. But I think also this is a book about love. This is a book about dying people and the people they love and the people who love them. But it's also how love is part of the service of good healthcare practitioners, that it's not an emotion, it's kind of a decision and it's a way of acting. And we call it kindness when it's between strangers, but it's actually about love. So I think we've got to get back to using the language and stop being embarrassed about it.
That sort of aspect of denial is huge, isn't it? And there's one, is it Sally? I think you wrote about Sally, who was in denial until the very last moment. In fact, she never came out of denial, did she?
No, and in fact, it was Sally's story that I told on Radio 4 that made the person who's now my very, very fantastic agent get in touch with me because I told the story and he wondered if I had other stories to tell. And so, yes, I remember her story. One of the things, of course, is that everybody's names in the book have been changed, or almost everybody. So when people say to me, oh, I really love the story about X, and I have to think, oh,
who was that?
Who was that? And then I have to say, tell me what that, you know, I remember another story. So tell me what this person's called in the book so that I don't say their real name by mistake. Sally was such an extraordinary experience for me because I'd first met her when I was still a cancer research doctor. And she was having experimental treatment for her cancer. And then I met her again when I was quite a young hospice doctor, and she was terminally ill and in hospital and in complete denial. And the thing that I think is really important about denial, and she's a great illustration of it, is that if you really do not believe that the thing that everybody else thinks is happening to you is happening to you, then you won't feel all of those awful emotions that go with believing that. So denial is an emotionally safe place.
Yeah.
And that is something that we've got to recognize when people say, oh, he's not accepting, he's not coming to terms with it, he's in denial. Well, great. So that's fine for him. It's not fine for the people around him who know that there are things they want to say. And it's certainly not fine, as I've seen in the past, if it's a new diagnosis of something very serious and treatment is possible, but the person won't believe they've got the illness and therefore they won't accept the treatment. So that could be very difficult. But people who are doing denial at the very end of life maintain their comfort. The difficulty is for most people gradually it becomes harder and harder to maintain the illusion that there's nothing wrong as more and more difficult things happen. And so gradually the denial starts to crumble. And as the denial crumbles, you've then got to deal with the emotional load of realizing what's really happening. So that can be very difficult. And it's actually easier to do that a long time in advance. For this particular person, though, for Sally, she actually managed to stay resolute in her denial. Right, 20 minutes before she lapsed into unconsciousness at the very end of her life, she was still telling the people in the bedroom that I'm going to beat this thing. So she maintained her composure throughout. But the thing that was really difficult was it meant her parents and her husband couldn't say goodbye.
Yeah.
So we had to find ways of enabling them to tell her all the things that were important to them, how much they loved her, how proud of her they were, in ways that were just like a family reminiscing around a bed while they're waiting for somebody to get better, rather than saying goodbye. It's very, very hard.
I thought it was amazing how you counselled the family to do that, because you knew that that was what they needed, because it's not just about what the dying person needs, it's what the people left behind need as well. And my father didn't deny his death, but he didn't talk about it. He didn't talk to any of us. So I was one of those people just left with, and there was a 2-week period in which he was dying, but it was all very sudden at the end. But he'd been ill for such a long time, and yet there was no space there, and I often think there's a wonderful phrase, I can't remember who says it, but if you can actually make your own death your last gift to your loved ones by giving them that space, that time, that care, that love, whatever it might be.
And you do meet a lot of people who do that, who have that kind of very gracious sense that I'm part of a community of people here and I might be doing the dying, but they are my companions in the journey. And they're very appreciative of it. And one of the things that was very, very touching for me was probably in the last year, maybe the last 2 years before I retired, very, very senior consultant who'd been one of my mentors and then had retired became my patient. And so I became one of his companions at the edge of life, because I wasn't just his doctor, I'd been his trainee. He was one of my personal heroes. And he was teaching me from his deathbed. He said, this is really interesting. He said, you need to know this for your other patients, that these things are going through my mind and other people might worry about these things too. And, how fantastic that he was using his experience still to sculpt me into the best version of a doctor in palliative medicine that I could be. It was absolutely such a privilege. But that was his nature. He was a teacher, another amazing storyteller and artist. So he told stories visually as well. And there's something about people who look after their companions that's really, really interesting and very special. And lots of people do it.
But do you also find that there are a lot of people who, if not in complete denial, just will not talk about it?
A lot of people who fear taking the lid off will unleash a set of emotions that they'll never be able to control again. So I meet a lot of people who feel sad that they'll never feel normal again. And by that, they might mean I'll never not have pain again, or I'll never not have nausea again, which is obviously where palliative care first started with physical symptom management. But also I'll never not feel sad again, or I'll never not feel anxious again. And to be able to help them get to grips with their emotional distress and resume some sense of control is really, really important. And I think it's a very privileged position if you're a companion of somebody who's dying, but you're not part of their close inner circle of friendship. So that's who we are, the palliative care team, and end-of-life doulas and soul midwives, people who done this special training to be able to be lay companions. Likewise, we're able to have conversations that perhaps feel too difficult to have with close family. And yet quite often we're also having the same conversation with close family in a different room. And again, there's a story of an elderly couple who are each protecting each other in the book. And you know, when the husband opened the front door to me, because I'd come to do a nausea and vomiting consultation, I hadn't come to do an end of life consultation, he took me into the living room and, you know, told me that I was not to tell his wife under any circumstances any bad news. And you know, he then took me upstairs to meet his wife, and she sent him downstairs to make me a cup of tea. Have you not made the doctor a cup of tea? And as he's going out of the bedroom, he's making signals from behind the door. You know, I'm watching you. Okay, that's really clear. And as soon as he's going down the stairs, she's saying, I don't know what to do. He doesn't seem to realize how sick I am. How can I tell him that I'm dying?
Oh my goodness.
And these people who just love each other, but they don't want to upset each other. And it's a really common thing in palliative care of dancing that very particular dance that gradually lets both parties know that this isn't a secret to either of them. And that actually, usually when they are upset about things, they lean in and they share them. And here's this really major thing, and they've got their backs to each other, emotionally speaking. So it's a very, very emotional thing to do, but it's a really helpful thing for patients and families if that's what they want. Some patients do not want to have to carry the emotional burden of their family's distress. You know, they're up to here with what they're dealing with and they can't take anymore. So it's not about engineering a solution that makes the interfering palliative care team feel happy. It's about understanding what's going to be the solution that's going to help and support this person the best.
So how can we all prepare for a good death?
I suppose one of the things that's quite important is that we recognise that we're all going to die. And yeah, you know, that sounds very basic, but we do spend at least the first third of our 70 years and 10 with no notion at all that dying is a thing that might happen to us. Obviously, it happens to other people, it happens to old people, it happens to people on the telly. It happens to all the baddies in stories, but none of the goodies. And then gradually, life shows us that it's not really like that. So recognizing that we're going to die is the first step in recognizing that actually, therefore, being alive is a transient thing, and it's a precious thing, and it's a special thing. So there's something about using it well for the things that matter to us, and they'll be very different from person to person, but it's about what matters to us that makes it special. Understanding what the process of dying is like, I think, is a really, really helpful thing for people, and we can talk about that a bit in a moment. But to know that it's not like on the telly and it's not like on Hollywood, I think is a really helpful thing, because death is used as a device in drama where actually what's happening is not to the person who's dying, it's to the characters around the bed to help the plot move on. And so we don't see dying depicted well. And I used to get really, really mad about this. And actually, it was Carrie-Ad Lloyd, who's a writer and a comedian and who runs the Griefcast podcast. I was talking to her about it, and she was explaining, oh yeah, well, of course, as writers, we're using it as a device. It's not about the dying person, of course. And as soon as she said it, it all made sense. That's why it's so badly done.
Yeah.
And a shout out for Coronation Street, who actually did a really good end of life storyline with their character Sinead, was it, or Siobhan? Sorry, Corrie watchers,
I can't
didn't
help
watch
you with
it.
that one.
But they did take advice from palliative care experts, and they ran the whole thing really, really well, and even avoided souping it up in the very last scenes, which sometimes happens. So understanding that dying is a process, like giving birth is a process. Your body is going to go through a sequence of changes that will be pretty well predictable from one person to the next, and they'll be as individual as individuals are. So, you know, any woman who's given a baby who's given birth to a baby has had a perfectly individual, unique experience. But whatever midwife was with her, we're seeing the same old, and adapting it for this woman under these circumstances. And I think that dying is the same. Of course, it's different because every person is different and the people around them are different, but the process is very similar. And then I think that being able to talk to people about, if I was so sick that I was going to die, where would I want to be? How much treatment is too much treatment? How much treatment is not enough treatment? There's a lot of misunderstanding about the process of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, for example, CPR, and it might be helpful to talk a little bit about that in a moment as well, because one of the things that we're thinking about here is that although we're talking about people as though everybody is very similar, of course, we're not all the same. And your target audience of women of a certain age very often are the people who are caring for older relatives who are approaching the ends of their lives, at the same time as trying to explain all of that to younger relatives who are the generation below, and hold their stuff together whilst they're stressed to hell in both directions. Yeah.
And there's menopause as well and all of that.
Yeah, so let's not even go there. And yet, of course, that is exactly where people are going, and they're trying to deal with life-changing events in the midst of life-changing hormones at the same time as their young people are trying to make their own lives. And it's really, really challenging. So actually helping us to understand what is and what isn't likely to happen towards the very end of somebody's life can help us to decide whether we can commit, for example, to bringing somebody to live with us for their terminal illness, and what questions to ask before we commit to that, because we could maybe manage that for a weekend or a week, or, you know, if you've got plenty of help, maybe a few weeks. But what if it goes on for months? What if it goes on for years? So we do have to think about what our resources are and what the implications of doing that will be on the other people in the family, the young people who we're trying to help to grow into their best potential, and what's it going to be like for them if they've got a dying relative living in the house. And I don't think that that's an entirely negative thing. I think it's a really interesting, helpful experience for young people to understand it and be guided through. But it's not going to be the same home life that they would have had if that wasn't going on in their house.
But then that brings to the question that I know you hate, which is how long has he got, or how long has the dying person got? Because yes, if you are going to make that decision about bringing someone into the home, how long? That's a really tricky one, isn't it? It's very difficult, and a lot of women, you know, in midlife will be grappling with that, and will grapple with it from now onwards. Often.
So one of the things about that is that it depends on the illness. So if somebody is dying from something that's got a relatively predictable trajectory, cancer probably one of the most predictable trajectories. Some of the neurodegenerative illnesses, motor neuron disease in particular, they tend to change at a rate that, once it establishes itself, is noticeable and anticipatable for that person. So if you think about us in our midlife prime, as we are, I know that I'm not running as fast now as I ran 10 years ago. So there's a change in me over a decade that's noticeable. So that probably means I'm measuring my life expectancy in decades. But a time will come when my running times are going to be deteriorating year on year on year. And then I know that I'm measuring in years into decades maybe. If I have a serious illness where actually this month I'm not as strong as I was 6 months ago, then the changes are happening within a year. And now we're talking about months into years. And by the time the changes are observable month by month, we're talking about counting in months as the currency.
Mm.
And as time goes by, we find that people are more and more weary, even week by week. And so now we're talking about weeks into months, possibly.
Mm.
But it's a way of guesstimating by watching
Yes.
what's happening to this person. There are illnesses, though, that are much less predictable than that. And I'm thinking about, particularly if we've got really elderly relatives who've managed to collect, like brownie badges, a whole association, a whole assortment of illnesses. So, you know, their joints are really sore, so they don't move as much as they could, which means that their stamina never gets pushed. So now they're more easily tired, and they've got a heart that isn't as strong as it was, so that doesn't move fluid around their bodies as well as it should. So their ankles swell, or they get a bit of fluid in their lungs, and then they get breathless, and then they don't move as much. So, you know, you can end up with a bit of heart failure, and your lungs aren't so great, your joints are a bit creaky, and maybe your kidneys are slowing down a bit, with or without your memory going, and with or without developing dementia. So you can just have physical frailty with a very sharp mind, but very often in extreme old age, physical frailty and also some cognitive failure as well. And the thing that's difficult about that is that it tends to be a very, very slow decline down a gradually sloping hill, rather than that much more obvious decline of, for example, end-stage cancer.
Yeah.
So you can have the crisis where the elderly relative is rushed into hospital and they almost die, and they're snatched from the jaws of death in the hospital, but they're not well enough now to get back to their own home. And what are we going to do? And I've always promised my mum that she would never go into a home. But actually, I haven't got a spare room in my house. I've got A-levels happening for one of my teens and GCSEs happening for another one of my teens. I've got somebody who's keeping odd hours because they're on an apprenticeship scheme. Someone will have to sleep on the sofa if we bring mum to live with us. Well, we can manage that for a few weeks. Yes. But actually, mum might be going to survive for months and months and months. And who's going to sleep on the sofa for that length of time? And is that fair? So those are the sorts of conversations where it kind of feels callous to be having that conversation with the doctors and the nurses and the social workers in the hospital. And yet we can't make an arrangement that's going to look after mum, look after mum's grandchildren, and look after me, who's trying to look after everybody, if we don't sit down and think about it really honestly and really carefully from the very beginning.
I remember it was just 2 years ago now, 18 months ago, my mum was very ill in hospital. She had a brain hemorrhage, and we thought she was going to die. And then she had surgery and she made a miraculous recovery. And it was like a teenager. We couldn't keep up with the speed of her recovery. We was like, Mum, slow down, slow down. But my head immediately went into, if she comes out of hospital, can she come to me? And the biggest issue was she wasn't mobile. And I have just a couple of little steps between my lounge and my kitchen and my hallway and the bedroom downstairs. So it's not on the flat. So it's just, even that, I was thinking, how could we do it? We just can't. She would be marooned in one area of the house, unable to get anywhere else. If she was wheelchair bound. Fortunately, it didn't happen, but immediately you go into that kind of crisis thinking, don't you? How can you make it work?
Yeah, and I'm sure there are lots of people listening who've done what we've done, which is walk around our house and think about, if we had to build a downstairs bathroom, where would that go? Where are the drains? Where are the water pipes? The place where you would obviously put a downstairs bathroom isn't near any of the plumbing, for example. That's not good. And sometimes, logistically, love isn't enough. That actually we've got to be really practical. And if this is going to be for the long haul, our job might be to continue to be the loving relative and not the exhausted carer. And that sometimes letting other people take the caring burden so that we can continue to pitch up and maintain our relationship with that person and all of our other responsibilities might be the way of doing it, but it makes people feel terribly, terribly guilty.
Mm. But I know you said earlier about talking about what the actual end of death is, and I now know that, and I feel very privileged and blessed to know that. But your message is to make sure that everybody knows what the actual death looks like.
So should we talk about that a bit?
Go on then.
So going back to the analogy of understanding about birth and giving birth, what happens is that fairly soon after we have a positive pregnancy test, we get into a system that starts to prepare us for delivering a baby. And it does that by telling us what to expect. And it tells us what to expect in a way that doesn't leave much room for doubt. So they show you diagrams, and they show you videos, and they give you a plastic pelvis and a plastic doll's head, and you've got to post this
very
doll,
impossible,
and you just think, that's never going to happen. This wasn't my brightest idea. And people talk about the sensations that you're going to feel, what it's going to feel like as the baby's head is coming down, what contractions are going to feel like, how you're going to push, how you're going to pause, what you're going to do with your breathing to enable you to pause, how are you going to manage the pain control, write your plan, all the rest. And midwives are great, aren't they? So they have women writing a plan, and they don't laugh. Completely straight face, even though they know all the different ways that we might end up not being able to fulfill this plan. But what we're really doing is getting women to think about, what will it be like when I'm in labour, giving birth to this baby, and can I really do that up a tree in a water bath in an orchard? Or, actually, would the midwifery-led unit in the local hospital possibly be a better place?
Health and safety.
Okay, but you really can't plan how to give birth if you don't know what giving birth is going to involve. So I guess that's how I feel about preparing people for dying. So a midwife in the room with a woman in labour is reminding her, we've talked about this, that feeling you've got now, that's that pressure feeling we talked about, that feeling you've got now, that's the contractions we talked about. Do you remember we talked about panting? I need you to pant now. You remember we talked about, you would feel that you wanted to push, and I would ask you not to. This is that moment. Don't push, just pant. They've done a kind of cognitive rehearsal. They've gone through it in their heads in advance, and now they're being reminded. So here's our kind of midwife introduction to dying, that the process is that it doesn't really matter what illness you've got towards the very end of life, that final sequence is very, very similar. And largely it's about our bodies running out of energy. So we're weary, we sleep a lot, the sleep recharges our energy batteries a bit. We can be awake again for a while, but gradually the amount of time we can stay awake for gets less, and the amount of time we're spending asleep gets more. And if the disease that we've got isn't interfering with our mind or our brain, then we'll be our normal, usual waking self when we're awake. And if we're looking after a relative who, for example, has got dementia, their dementia isn't going to accelerate in this period. If they could still usually recognize you, for example, when they were awake, then as they go into this phase of sleeping more and waking less, they'll still recognize people when they're awake. And as time goes by, we find people are asleep more and they're awake less. And an interesting thing happens that the person it's happening to doesn't notice, but the rest of us do, which is that sometime during this period of not being awake for long and being asleep a lot, some of the sleeps dip deeper into actual unconsciousness. When the person wakes up, they tell us they've had a lovely sleep. So we know that human beings don't recognize when we become unconscious, which is probably why it's called unconscious. But maybe there was a phone call, or medicines were due, or a visitor came while that person was asleep. We tried really hard to wake them up and we couldn't. So we know that they were unconscious, but they have no sensation of that at all. That would normally be the phase where you might change the way somebody takes their medications, because if they've got an illness that in the background might be causing them to have breathlessness or causing them to have pain or nausea or something like that, they'll usually be on regular medications to keep those symptoms away. And we don't want them to miss a dose of that, and then when they do wake up, suddenly find out that also they're overwhelmed by whatever that symptom was, because they've missed the drug that keeps the symptom away. So very often we change to using injections at that point, and rather than give people lots of different injections through the day, we'll often put the medicines into one of those little syringe driver pumps. And it's the same equivalent dose. So the dose isn't increasing, the person isn't becoming less awake because they're having injections. It's the illness itself that's gradually taking away their ability to stay awake. And eventually the person is just unconscious all of the time. Now, once we're unconscious, what's actually happening is that all the different bits of the brain are switching off. And once we're completely unconscious, the only bit of the brain that is still awake is this bit that drives our breathing, which sits right at the bottom of the brain at the back. So everything above that has gone, switched off. And the breathing center gives us just a breathing routine that's completely automatic. It's just a reflex. So most of the time we don't think about our breathing, but right now, everybody's thinking about their breathing. Right now, you're breathing quietly so that you don't breathe into your microphone, and I'm breathing quietly, but in a way that allows me to take sufficient breath to speak a whole phrase, and then take the next breath, and then speak again. So we do manage our breathing, although we don't think about managing our breathing when we're conscious. When we're unconscious, it's this automatic cycle, and the cycle goes between deep and shallow, and it goes between fast and slow. So there could be phases of it when it's quite deep, and also as we breathe out, because we're not conscious of the position of our muscles anymore, the muscles in our larynx, our vocal cords, might be a little bit closed over. So as we breathe out, we might make a noise, a kind of noise. Now, if you didn't know, you might think that person was sighing or groaning or trying to talk. So it's really important that families who are sitting around the bed understand that this is a sign of unconsciousness and not a sign of distress. Similarly, there could be phases of the breathing where it's quite fast, but it's shallow, and that would look like panting, and you might think that person was breathless. And during the very slow phases, there can be quite long pauses, and then when the breath comes, it's like a gasp, and you might think that person was gasping for breath and struggling. So it's really important that people understand that this movement between deep breathing and shallow breathing, fast breathing and slow breathing, noisy breathing and not so noisy breathing, is all just a reflex driven by the brain, and not something that's a response to feeling frightened, feeling pain, feeling breathlessness. Another thing that happens is that mostly we're nursing people in bed, they're usually lying back. And so if there's bits of saliva or bits of phlegm that come up from their chest lying in the back of their throat, they don't clear their throats. Now, you or I, if we had even, a tiny biscuit crumb, a little bit of tea goes down the wrong way, we know. We cough, we splutter, we gag, we swallow. This is one of the most sensitive areas in our body because it's a survival reflex to keep the throat clear. So if this person is letting fluid lie at the back of their throat, we will hear the air coming in and out of their lungs, making a bubbling noise. It sounds like a clicking noise. It sounds like a rattle. And people talk about it as the death rattle. And actually, it's a sign that they are so deeply unconscious that they no longer have sensation that then triggers this kind of reflex coughing and spluttering in their throat. They're deeply, deeply unconscious. But people talk about the death rattle as though it's something terrible, because it's really weird to listen to. And normally, if we have somebody who's deeply unconscious, so unconscious that they're not defending their airway, we put them in the recovery position, particularly to stop fluid lying at the back of their throat. We don't want to put our dearly beloved person who's dying into the recovery position. It's not a really comfortable position to lie in. It's not a position where it's easy to hold somebody's hand or stroke their cheek. So instead, we've got them lying back, but because they're lying back, they're making this funny noise. Sometimes we can help to clear their throat with a suction. Maybe we can change position so they lie on their side a little bit. But the main thing about the death rattle is that everybody in the room understands what it is. And even though it's weird and odd, it's not uncomfortable for the person that it's happening to. And so at the very end of somebody's life, they may or may not be making a rattling noise, but they will be breathing very gently. It will usually be quite slow. There will be pauses. And then there'll just be an out breath that doesn't seem any different from any of the previous out breaths, but just doesn't get followed by another breath in. There's nothing special about it at all. It's very, very peaceful. There's no sudden sitting up telling people where the treasure was buried or anything like that. There's no sudden rush of pain or choking or panic at the very end. It's just very, very gentle. And actually, once people have seen it, I've described this now to, I don't know, thousands and thousands of people. Lots and lots of them have been nodding as I'm saying, oh yes, so this is what happened when, and then they will remember the deaths that they've been at. And then they'll say, and the thing that makes me very sad, I thought that what we saw when my mum died was unusual. It was so peaceful. We never tell people what it was like because we know it's normally so awful and we don't want people to feel bad that we had such an easy time of it and that it was so gentle for our mum. I think, oh no, I really want you to go away and tell people about how your mum died because what you're describing is normal dying. And actually, the more of us who understand normal dying, the better. We've revolutionized midwifery care by knowing what good, safe childbirth looks like and knowing when to get help when it's not going well. Well, if we all knew what good, safe, normal dying looked like, then we wouldn't tolerate somebody having escalating discomfort or increasing breathlessness or sensation of panic as they were dying. We would know this is not normal. We shouldn't be putting up with this. We should be getting somebody to help with this because this is not okay and it doesn't need to be like this.
I suppose we're very lucky in our society, though, to have palliative care and to have the medicines and the medications to enable, pain and discomfort to be managed. But would I be right in thinking that the actual final act of death is still going to be the same, even if it's somebody dying within a culture where they've not had their pain managed before their death?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So let's just pause for a moment to think about how lucky we are that the process I'm describing is the process for everybody. But if you have an illness that causes you distress or pain, then those pain messages are coming up the sensory nerves into the brain. And even though the brain is starting to shut down, those sensations start to trigger awareness. They start to trigger alertness. And so they slow down that descent into unconsciousness. So the more somebody has pain, for example, the longer it will take them to reach that point of being down to only the very last few breaths being driven by the brain. So having good pain control allows the process just to proceed normally. And in the same way as some mums don't need analgesia during childbirth, and I'm not saying that childbirth is comfortable for them, but they've decided to do without having pain control. And other people have more discomfort and they need to have pain control during the birth of their baby. There are some people who have no pain at all. Their illness is not an illness that causes pain, and so that sequence of events that we've just described is just what will happen to them. There are other people who have pain, and that sequence of events won't be as smooth as that if pain keeps interrupting it. So if you're living in sub-Saharan Africa where only 1 person in 50 has access to morphine if they need it, then dying will take longer because it is so uncomfortable that the discomfort keeps awakening the person from the unconsciousness that their brain is trying to withdraw into. So we've got a real problem around the world about availability of pain relief. And it's being made a little bit more difficult by the emphasis of the Americans on their opioid addiction epidemic that they've got, because they are trying to influence the World Health Organization to limit the availability of opioids around the world, whereas the rest of the world is actually desperate for laws that allow better access to medicinal opioids. So there are two opioid crises. There's an over-provision crisis in the United States, and then there's an under-provision crisis in most of the developing world.
Fascinating. Wow. Yeah, that puts a whole different perspective of a layer of argument on the making these opioids more available, doesn't it?
Absolutely does. Yeah, because I think it's one of the myths about morphine is that it kills people and it shortens their lives. And, you know, if you and I, who are healthy people who haven't got pain at the moment, were to take a big dose of morphine right now, we'd probably go to sleep, because pain is a kind of natural balance to taking the morphine, keeping you awake. If we carried on taking morphine, and because we haven't got pain, we might get a nice, woozy, euphoric feeling. 1 person in 10 will get a miserable dysphoric feeling. That's just the way they're genetically wired. So not everybody gets a high with morphine. And drug addicts get addicted to the high. If you've got a pain and you take morphine, and the morphine takes your pain away, that seems to happen instead of getting a high. So you don't get that emotional addiction when you're taking morphine for pain that you would get if you were taking morphine just for kicks. And the difficulty that drug addicts get into is that the dose that you need to give you that high gets higher and higher and higher. So they need to keep taking more and more and more until eventually the dose they're taking is higher than the dose that stops them from breathing. If you've got pain, it's naturally maintaining your brain to stay awake and breathe, even if you're taking morphine. And in fact, once you've found the dose of painkiller that stops the pain, it doesn't the dose doesn't change very much after that. If your cancer gets a bit more extensive, you might need a slightly bigger dose. But we don't see people dying of morphine suppressing their breathing in the way that happens with people who are taking morphine who haven't got a medicinal need to take the morphine. We do have people who take morphine for a long, long time, and then we find a better way of managing their pain. Imagine somebody who's got, it's one of the stories in the book, the lady who has pain in her hip. In fact, she breaks her hip in a wedding dress shop. She eventually had a hip replacement. She was one of the very first people to have a hip replacement because there was cancer rather than just, a trauma to the bone. And of course, once the hip was replaced and she got over her surgery, her hip wasn't sore anymore. So we then spent about 10 days gradually bringing the dose of morphine down a little bit each day, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Because if we just stopped it completely after she'd been taking it for several weeks, she'd have got the same cold turkey that any drug addict would, because her body was used to having morphine in the system. But that didn't mean she was an addict. She wasn't craving a high from having morphine. And by gradually reducing the dose, we were able to stop it completely. And that lady walked her daughter up the aisle on her wedding day. So morphine's a really safe drug if it's used well, if it's used properly, if it's the right dose at the right time in the right person. There can be a lot of fear about it, but actually, if it's used properly, it's completely safe.
Another thing that we touched on earlier was resuscitation, and I would like to talk a little bit about that, but particularly about Dan, who was the young man who had 2 terminal illnesses and found his purpose, his, by actually going on television and talking about having built his end of life plan and exactly what he wanted to happen.
Dan is one of my all-time heroes, and Dan is his name. And Dan read his chapter of the book. And when you're ready to broadcast this podcast, I will tell Dan's mum that it's here for her to listen to. Dan was a young man who had muscular dystrophy. And so as he was growing up as a little boy, he gradually lost the use of the muscles in his body. So he developed normally, and then it was more difficult for him to walk, and then it was more difficult for him to move his arms. And gradually, by the time I met Dan in his early 20s, he was using an electric wheelchair, and his movements were limited to little bits of movement in his hands and wrists, which he lost over the period of time that I knew him. But he always still had good movements of his face muscles, so he was able to talk very clearly. He had a mighty mind, Dan. He was a very deep thinker. I first met Dan because he was profoundly depressed, and he'd been referred by his GP to a local psychiatry team for treatment of his depression. And somebody from the psychiatry team came out to meet him. And they didn't normally deal with people who have physical illnesses. And here was somebody with a terminal illness who wanted to commit suicide, not so that he didn't have to die of his illness, but just because he was so depressed that he didn't want to be alive anymore. And Dan just kind of messed with this poor person's mind as he was assessing him. So the assessor wrote a really helpful report that went back to the GP and said, this person needs somebody who understands psychiatry in a physical health setting. So Dan was referred to my clinic. I ran a cognitive behaviour therapy clinic in a hospice. And it was an absolute pleasure to meet him. He was a little bit older than my own son, and he was in that phase of young adult life where most other adults are completely stupid, and you speak to them in single syllables and you don't make eye contact. And I had one of those at home, so that was fine. I really understood the model. And after a little bit of dancing around whether or not we were going to talk to each other, Dan told me that actually he'd been trying to think about how he was going to commit suicide, and he thought about driving his electric wheelchair into a lake to do that. And the difficulty was that he couldn't get it in deep enough, and we just had this kind of slightly crazy conversation about different ways that the electricity and the water, and pity that we couldn't this and pity we couldn't that. And I think eventually he realized that my sense of humor was as bad as his sense of humor, and therefore I was going to be on his team. And gradually he was great with the cognitive therapy. He really learned to notice his unhelpful thoughts, to challenge them, to give himself opportunities to succeed at things. He had a big circle of friends in the virtual world because he played computer games a lot. And of course, in computer games, everybody's equal, because if you can manage the Xbox controller, you're as fit as any other player. So he could run and he could jump and he could shoot or whatever it was in these games, and he was really, really good at these games, and they used to chat to each other as well. So he had this great rich social life through his computer, and gradually his depression got better. But of course the difficulty was that although we had helped him to no longer want to be dead because of his depression, the fact was that his disease was progressing and he was soon going to be dead anyway. But he had this period of time in between where actually he wanted to be alive, he relished being alive, but he felt that maybe in some way he didn't have a mission in life, he wasn't going to accomplish anything in life. And one of the things we'd done to help him feel less out of control was to think about what treatments he would and would not want to have towards the very end of his life. And Dan understood, for example, that when he came to that phase of life that he was gradually becoming less conscious, less awake, all his systems winding down, and eventually his breathing would stop. That's not the same as a young man at the same age as him being well and then suddenly having a catastrophe where his breathing and his heart would stop, and cardiopulmonary resuscitation as an emergency response to that being something that could save that young man's life until he could get to hospital and have treatment. But an ambulance finding a young man in a state of collapse, even a young man with the wheelchair beside him, would have no way of knowing that, and they would start cardiopulmonary resuscitation. So Dan wanted to have a do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation order to protect him from being interfered with as he was dying. He also wanted to write an emergency healthcare plan so that he could stay at home when he was dying, and any out of hours GP staff, district nursing staff, ambulance staff who might come into the house would have a whole menu of, this is Dan, this is what's wrong with him, these are the things that might go wrong when he's sick enough to die, this is how to manage his symptoms, this is how to keep him at home. But he also said, for example, he was likely to get chest infections because he couldn't take deep breaths and clear his lungs. If I ever had a chest infection that could get better if I went into hospital for a while, I'd be willing to go into hospital for a while, provided I didn't get put on a ventilator, and provided if it looked like I was so sick that I might die, they would send me home. So he had this really complicated set of instructions. And at the time, we were piloting a new system for the whole of the northeast of England, which is where he lived and I worked, where instead of having a different set of instructions for every organisation that might look after you, you had a single set of instructions kept in a bright yellow envelope by the patient. And wherever you go, the instructions go with you. And this was a national first to have a single set of instructions accepted by every healthcare and social care provider across the whole patch. And we were about to have this big launch, and there was going to be telly and there was going to be radio, and I was the regional lead for it. And I can't imagine anything more dull than some doctor on the telly waving a yellow envelope and saying, hey guys, you all need to do this. But there's Dan sitting in my clinic one day saying, and I will leave this world and I really won't have made a difference. And of course, he's made a difference to everybody who loves him, but he's talking about something else. And I thought, now here's somebody who could talk on the telly, who could wave a yellow envelope, who just is so articulate. He's worked it all out. He really understands it. So he became our poster boy for our emergency healthcare planning, our do not attempt CPR orders and everything else across the whole of the region. And it would have been a real palaver for him to have to go into the different telly studios. So they came to him. So the BBC and the independent television people came out. He was interviewed on the local radio and on regional radio, the journalists in his house. And he just did this fantastic job, and his mum was fantastic, and she was bringing cups of tea in and out for all of these journalists. We had photos in the garden. Everybody must have been exhausted by the end of the day. But the website for this central system of having the forms and being able to download them was suddenly inundated with hits, people wanting to know. And then a few weeks later, one of the consultants in the muscular dystrophy team that had looked after Dan got in touch to let me know that they'd had people with the same condition in the clinic wanting those papers that Dan on the telly has, so that they could talk about their plans as well. So he made an absolutely huge difference. In fact, after the book was written, he went on to test his own emergency healthcare plan to destruction. He did get admitted to hospital with a chest infection. He did end up in an intensive care unit. Having had all of those preparatory conversations meant that the consultants in the intensive care unit knew exactly how to pitch the conversation with him. He was able to make decisions and able to say yes and no to things, and able to get home in order to die in his own home. And it's absolutely a tribute to him and to his mum that he managed to do that, and he is absolutely one of my heroes.
What a remarkable young man. Wow.
Indeed.
Quite incredible. And then I suppose I could talk about this for hours. I really could, but I realised we've gone on quite a lot. This is a lot longer than I usually have the interviews, but I just felt this topic really deserves it, and there is so much more we could talk about. But there is one thing that I'm personally very interested to know. I wrote a blog post a little while ago that was brought on by friends of mine dying. People of my age or just a little bit older. And it was about, the title of it was "When a Little Bit of Faith Might Help." I don't have any religious faith. I grew up with faith, I grew up with going to church, but it's not something I've personally got in my own life. But whenever somebody close to me dies, I find myself drawn to a church just because it's a nice place and it's familiar and it's gentle and it's calming for me. And I wrote this blog post about how sometimes I think it would be really nice to have faith, because it might help, because people who have faith, have an idea of, what's going to happen after death. So I suppose what I wanted to know is, in all of your experience, have you noticed whether there is any difference in how the person that's dying copes with their death, or whether the people around them cope with their death better or worse, regarding whether they have some faith or not?
I think that's a really great question. So I'm going to broaden it a little bit beyond faith, because what I've observed is that towards the end of people's lives, people who know that they are dying, or even just people who are getting older who realize that time is becoming limited, start to make a reckoning of what their life has been worth. And they measure that against whatever is the system of values that's important to them. So for some people, that is a faith system. So it might be, how good a Buddhist have I been, or how faithful to my Reformed synagogue Judaism have I been, or how good a Methodist have I been, how good a Christian have I been. But it also might be, how much have I lived up to my values of wanting to save the planet and live a green life. Or I had one lady who was a very, very devout conservative, and we found her Conservative Party card in her handbag after she died, because she was a lady who lived alone, and we hadn't managed to find relatives by the time she died in hospital. So what am I worth gets measured according to a belief system. And if people have really been devout adherents to a particular way of looking at life, they find that very comforting. So partly in their self-appraisal, and for people who are very devout theists who believe that after death there is a thing that happens that is safe and comforting, they find that very safe and comforting. Apart from the ones who are worried that they haven't been good enough, who then feel very frightened. So faith isn't always helpful. Sometimes actually it's quite scary. And people who believe that there's nothing, so they're devout atheists and they're sure that there is oblivion, feel sad about oblivion, but are comforted that they don't have to worry about something else happening that they're not prepared for afterwards. Does that make sense?
Yes.
The rest of the world, though, sits somewhere in the middle, where they've been slightly tepid in some kind of religious or quasi-religious belief. And now that it isn't part of them in a really deep way, they don't quite know whether to embrace it more fully or just put it aside as not worth it. So it's really interesting how having a really well-formed set of beliefs in something or nothing seems to be more helpful than just being a bit lukewarm and in the middle.
So it's either one or the other, but not lukewarm in the middle. How interesting.
It is really, really fascinating.
Wow. Yeah, because I guess there is definitely, I mean, I think that reckoning, I mean, I think it starts very early. It's already started for me, which is why I'm doing this, and doing what I do with the Magnificent Midlife World, because going into the office every day doesn't cut it anymore. So to do something else.
Yeah.
That's how interesting. Yeah. So I've got to come down on one side of the fence or the other. Oh, darn it.
You could be a lukewarm believer in something, but a very, very strong believer in something else, couldn't you? You mightn't be quite sure whether or not there's God, but that you want to save the planet. And you might be judging yourself on your deathbed by your green credentials rather than your God credentials.
Oh, that'll work for me. Yeah, I can go with that. Yeah. Well, my goodness, it's been an absolute joy to talk to you about death today. That's all I can say. It's like, I knew this was going to be an incredible experience, and it has been. And I would honestly, everybody, just go read the book. It should be required reading for everybody.
Oh, thanks, Rachel.
Really should be. It's phenomenal, and it's so beautifully written. I mean, it's just wonderful. But if you can have your parting thoughts, Kathryn, what do you want to leave us with?
Dying, probably not as bad as you're expecting. And the more you know, the less there is to fear.
It's a bit like menopause, really.
So many ways.
I've just taken your last words. That's terrible. Sorry. Yeah, but the more we talk about it, the better it will be for all of us, huh?
Yeah, and I guess it's one of those courageous conversations that you know, just because you've talked about it doesn't mean you can't ever stop talking about it. I think people worry that once the genie's out of the bottle, we can't put it back in. Actually, the genie just floats away. So make sure that the people who are closest to you know what you would like, know what you don't want to happen, and if they ever have to make decisions for you, give them the gift of being clear about what you don't want. In law, we can't demand treatments, but we can refuse treatments, and we can do it in writing, and that makes it helpful. Or we can appoint attorneys. There's instructions online about how you do all of those sorts of things. There's a government website about it. The Age UK has guidelines for writing. And Compassion in Dying has a really lovely step-by-step taking you through writing an advanced decision to refuse treatment. That is probably the best website for doing that. So lots of help out there. Don't wish you'd done it. Do it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.